Chapter 1: The Origin of the Gold Coast Tribes. The country now known as the Gold Coast includes not only the colony proper, but also Ashanti and a small portion of the southern Sudan known as the Northern Territories. Its coastline extends from Newtown on the west to Aflao on the east, and, in addition to the Gold Coast as geographically defined, includes a part of the Slave Coast to the east of the river Volta. It is only within comparatively recent times that the greater part of this area has been included within the sphere of influence or been visited and explored by Europeans who, for many centuries, never penetrated more than a few miles into the interior. The history of the country lying along the coastline is fairly well known, for one European nation or another has held trading settlements there for over 500 years, and the works of several writers remain, giving a more or less complete account of different periods. Such discrepancies as occur between them are mainly attributable to international jealousies, for they were written at a time when several nations were on the coast together, contending the one against the other for the trade and regarding each other as interlopers. In these circumstances, it is not altogether unnatural that each writer should incline towards that version of any particular occurrence which redounds most to the credit of his own race. Apart from these works, there are no written records. The local history, however, has always been handed down verbally from one generation to another through the linguists, and such are their powers of memory that these accounts have been found remarkably accurate in those cases in which they could be checked by the written records. They are always entitled to consideration, and may usually be accepted as reliable so far as the incidents and sequence of events are concerned, and there is seldom any difficulty in fixing the approximate dates by the other contemporary occurrences. The records left by Europeans do not commence till the latter part of the 14th century, and none of them have left any account of any statements that may then have been made to them by the people as to their past history. Very little is known, therefore, about the origin of these tribes, and such accounts as have been handed down and are current among them at the present time are purely traditionary. The Gold Coast African, however, seldom emigrates. He will make long journeys for purposes of trade and may stay away for years, but he always tends to return to his original home. The linguists and better class people from whom these traditionary accounts of past events are obtained belong to families which have had their home in one and the same place from time immemorial. Among such a people, tradition has a far greater value than among less settled races, for places and natural objects connected with their past history are constantly before their eyes, and assist in preserving the story from generation to generation. The general sum of these traditions is that the Fantis, Ashantis, Wassails, and in fact all the tree-speaking or Akan peoples, were originally one tribe. They were a pastoral race and inhabited the open country beyond the forest belt and farther north than Salaga. A northern and lighter-skinned people, which is commonly supposed to have been the Fulanis, commenced to encroach on their territory, and being stronger than they, seized their cattle and young women and made many of the others slaves. After a time, the Akans began to migrate in small parties into the forest, where they built little villages and lived in hiding. As time went on, the number of these forest-dwelling fugitives increased until, in the course of many years, their numbers became very considerable. Their oppressors then heard of them and made several attempts to conquer and enslave them, but were unable to fight in the dense forest, and tiring of their want of success, eventually left them unmolested. Living in peace, the people continued to increase and gradually extended farther south until they had populated the forest belt and eventually reached the coast. The subdivision of the United Akan race into its main branches, the Fantis and the Ashantis, is variously accounted for. The split, however, seems to have occurred long before the coastline was reached, and while the principal settlements were in the country north of the river Pra, the present Adansi, and around Tekemen. One story very plausibly explains that the constant raids of their northern enemy, who burned all the farms, reduced the Akans to great straits for food. Some of them subsisted on a wild plant named fan, and others on a plant named shan, and thus gained the names Fanti and Shanti. Tea is to eat. The former subsequently migrated farther south, and the latter remained in the more northerly districts of the forest. But though this story accounts for the names Fanti and Ashanti, and it is worthy of note that the initial A of the letter is not pronounced by the people, it fails to explain why they separated. Another account says that a section of the people disliked the king and conspired to poison him. The names of the two tribes are derived from the names of the foods that they offered to him. The Fantis are said to have gathered fan, and the Ashantis a poisonous herb called asun, or ashuan, which, with the verb su, to gather, give the derivation of these names. The king, discovering what the Ashantis had done, naturally favored the Fantis, but they were not strong enough to withstand the jealousy and the oppression of the former, who ultimately drove them from the country. Yet another version of this story says that a quarrel arose among the people, who divided into two factions, one of which migrated farther south. They became known as the Fa Sifu, meaning a portion of the people who had cut themselves off the main body, and the others were called the Aswa Sifu, meaning the people who did not hearken because they refused to listen to the advice of the king when he wanted to restore peace and prevent the Ashantis from driving the Fantis away. The Fantis say that they found the forest uninhabited, and some of them settled there, founding the village of Kwaman. But the majority pushed on till they reached the coast. They are said to have been led by three chiefs, Osun, Obunumakuma, and Odapagan. They found the seaboard inhabited by two tribes, the Asibus and the Etsis, who united to oppose the newcomers. Cormantin is said to have been the principal town of the Asibus, and their chief, Amanfi, who is said to have been a giant, led them against the Fantis, defeated them, and compelled them to pay him tribute. Later, however, they organized a rebellion and drove the Asibus into the bush, but Amanfi, who was suffering from guinea worm in his legs and could not escape, was found in his house and put to death. The Elminas are said to have come to the coast at a later date, and to be an offshoot of the Ashantis, which would account for the fact that while the latter have always been the foes of the Fantis, their relations with the Elminas have been uniformly friendly. How much truth there may be in these accounts, it is impossible to say, but vague and uncertain though they may be, they are, nevertheless, not unreasonable and probably very fairly correct. The Fulanis are known to have been migrating in a southerly direction for centuries, and the Arabs had, even prior to the 11th century, founded states in the interior of Africa, one of the chief of which was Ghana, which is believed to have been near the present site of Sokoto. The country of Wangara belonged to this state, and though this name is now confined to a country quite distinct from Ashanti, the Mohammedans in Kumasi in 1821 told Mr. Dupuy, the British consul, that Ashanti was a part of Wangara. According to the Arab historians, the country to the south of Wangara was called Lamlam and was inhabited by a race of savages, whom the people living around the Niger used to hunt and to sell into slavery. It is, moreover, well known that the Mohammedans have only been able to conquer in countries where they could use cavalry, which would have been quite impossible in the dense forest of Ashanti, and might easily account for their lack of success against the Akans, who fled thither. In Winneba and some other places on the coast, a language is still spoken which is quite distinct from Tree. This language is gradually dying out, but it might well owe its origin to that of the tribes who were living on the coastline at the time of the Fanti immigration. Assuming the traditional account of their conquest to be substantially correct, it by no means follows that they were exterminated. It is far more probable that they would have been required to pay tribute to the Fantis, and if this was so, the natural conservatism of the African would be quite sufficient to account for their language and perhaps some of their customs having lingered in those parts of the coast where they settled. The different languages of the Akras and Apollonians, on the other hand, are to be accounted for by the fact that they are believed to be immigrants from the Slave and Ivory coasts, rather than true natives of the Gold Coast. The Akras, at least, have never succeeded in establishing themselves in the true forest districts, and the fact that the country now occupied by the Fantis was at one time inhabited by a very primitive race is proved by the discovery of a number of stone weapons and implements. The only argument that could be adduced to refute the general truth of these traditions is the fact that the Portuguese, when they first settled on the Gold Coast in 1482, found the people already grouped into separate petty kingdoms and tribes, and the question has been raised whether 4.5 centuries would afford sufficient time for the migration through the forest and the formation of these tribal distinctions. Each of the little states, however, probably arose from the settlement of one of the more powerful families of the immigrants with their dependents, for the family or patriarchal system is the fundamental principle of the Akan constitution. Another point in favor of a belief in the common origin of the Fantis and Ashantis is the existence among them of a number of definite families. At the present time, it is impossible to say what their original number may have been. It is certain, however, that some of them are of very much greater antiquity than others, which are believed to be offshoots from the parent stock due to quarrels or some other cause. The principal families are the Tweedan, leopard, Nsona, bushcat, Quona, buffalo, Intwa, dog, Anono, parrot, Abradzi, plantain, Abrutu, cornstalk, Apiadi, servant, and Yoko, red earth. There are several others, but these are generally acknowledged to be the oldest. The animals and the other objects from which they derive their names are commonly held sacred by their members. The name was probably given as a descriptive title to the original head of the family, a common practice amongst most primitive peoples. But in course of time, the fact that it was merely the name of an individual has been lost sight of, and later generations have come to regard these animals as their actual ancestors, or as the tutelary deities or the homes of the tutelary deities of their families. Members of these families are found among Fantis and Ashantis alike, and it would be difficult to find any explanation of this fact unless it is admitted that these tribes were at one time living together as one united people. Many of these names, too, seem to belong to an older dialect, for they are not those in common use among the Afantes at the present day. Moreover, though the members of these clans are now so widely scattered, a certain brotherhood still exists among them. The customary laws in use among all the Akan peoples, though varying slightly in different districts, just as the dialect they speak does, are, nevertheless, identical in principle and clearly point to a common origin. The same may be said of their religion, customs, and municipal regulations. Meredith, writing in 1811, while bearing out what has already been said about the origin of the Fantes, also records a tradition of their early government on the coast. He says, "The Fantes were originally an inland people and governed by the kings of Ashanti, but when they formed a separate state, we have no satisfactory accounts to determine. They, however, rebelled against the Ashanti government and fled towards the sea, where, it appears, they remained unmolested until very lately. When they considered themselves out of the Ashanti dominions and intolerable security, they appointed a person to govern them. But as they dreaded the vengeance of their old masters, and were fearful that on the promise of favour or reward this person would betray them, they had recourse to a singular expedient to prove his fidelity. They told him that he must consent to lose his left hand as the only token they considered sufficient to prove his attachment to them. The man hesitated at this extraordinary method of putting his fidelity to the test, when a general murmur arose against him, whereupon his cane-bearer stepped forward and exclaimed that if his master were unwilling to lose a hand for the good of the people, he was not, and laying his left arm upon the block, it was taken off. He was then constituted for their bafo, which term signifies captain or leader, and the person so appointed was endued with many privileges. His family were to be provided for and considered a kind of nobility, and his power was almost absolute. According to Bosman, however, the power of the Bafo was at first controlled by a council of elders, not unlike some European parliament, acting perfectly according to their inclinations, without consulting the Bafo, and it was not until later that the Bafos usurped greater powers, and their rule became so tyrannical and obnoxious to the people that their authority was expressly limited. In addition to the Akans, there were a number of other tribes, more especially in the northern territories, about whose origin little or nothing is known, and there were also many colonies of Hausas and Fulanis scattered throughout the country. But though something more is known of their early history, they are only aliens in the land and cannot legitimately be included among the tribes of the Gold Coast.